First, talk a little bit about who you are and why you know something about this.
Well, I decided to major in Russian studies, Soviet studies, when I was in the late 50s at Fordham University. And I was graduating in the spring of '61 when all hell broke loose with respect to the Soviet Union. My first chance to vote, John Kennedy, and my impressionistic reaction to his speech that I should come down here in Washington and do what I already decided to do, finish my military application as an intelligence officer, and then work for the CIA. I think Gore Vidal's DVD on the national security state was a good reminder of how this thing evolved. I think it's overly simplistic in many respects, and I think it really kind of downplays some of the realities that I know.
As a child, you're very formed by the culture of McCarthyism, Cold War television. How much did that shape who you were and how you looked at the world?
Well, it shaped a lot of who I was in high school and as I began college. But when I started looking into things and learning about the Soviet Union, learning about World War II, learning about the fact that the Soviet Union lost 20 million people in that war and had adequate reason to fear the Germans, for example, and fear us. And there was a balance that set in. And so I was ready by the time I went into the Army, came down to Washington to have a more balanced perspective on these things. But you're quite right. In the 50s, it was quite a different story, and we had to sort of kind of get out from under that sort of strata of propaganda, frankly. And Gore is very good on that, of course.
Gore describes the end of World War II, the end of the Roosevelt era, as a period where Roosevelt was able to make, obviously work with the Soviet Union and Stalin during World War II as allies for much of it, come to certain amounts of accommodation, including Yalta, and that Truman created a whole different approach. What do you make of Gore's analysis of this period?
I think it's overstated. The notion that Roosevelt had these accommodations worked out with Stalin, that Stalin wanted a more normal, civilized, at one point, it's a less tyrannical regime. I don't think that's historically accurate. And I think it sort of makes people like Gore Vidal easy targets for people who would like to tar progressives with that kind of brush, saying they overstate the case.
The basic thesis Gore gives is that Truman didn't demobilize after World War II, that the Soviet Union after World War II had been mostly destroyed. Yet Truman decided not to demobilize, to develop the nuclear weapons program, was part of a strategy of asserting America as the superpower. What do you think of this?
I think that came later. I think that tars Truman with a premature brush. I mean, there may have been some horses taking the cannon back to the Soviet Union, but there was as many taking those cannon westward toward East Germany, Poland, and even into the Balkans. I mean, nuclear weapons, well, the Soviets were the ones that developed the atomic bomb in 1950 and tested it and all. So, it was not as though Truman was seeing phantoms where they didn't exist. The Soviets were a real menace. They had taken over substantial parts of Eastern Europe. They were menacing even places like Italy and France. And that, of course, is part of the reason why they set up this operations part of the CIA, so that there could be some sort of operational covert action to influence Italian elections and that kind of thing.
One of Gore's ideas, and it's clear not only Gore has made this point, but that the strength of the Soviet Union and the threat of the Soviet Union was exaggerated to help rationalize this building of this military-industrial complex that Eisenhower talked about.
Well, I saw that play out in a personal way. You can read all the history books in the world, but when you know people like Richard Barnett, who came down here and worked for James J. McCloy, he was out of Harvard, Barnett went to Harvard Law School, incredibly bright guy, just died a couple of years ago. He came down to see if he could work on arms control. And he worked his rear end off. He got nowhere. And he told me, the forces against dealing honestly with the Russians on this issue were just unconquerable. That shows me that was real. And it sort of persists to today. The argument is always harder to make that the Soviets or the Russians are can be dealt with. And curiously, it was the intelligence community alone that enabled people like Ronald Reagan to deal with the Russians, because his big thing about doверяй, but проверяй, trust but verify. Well, we told the president, we can verify. And he said, sure. And we said, yeah. And the rest of the story. The arms control agreements which were substantial, back there during the 80s. Now, of course, now you don't have to anymore. And so it's just amazing that we still spend so much money on armaments. Gorbachev himself recently told a local newspaper in this country that it's just really incredible how much money we're spending, more than everybody else in the whole world. And for what, And Gorbachev knows what that burden is.
One of the things implied by Gore is that the arms industry itself, to some extent, fuels the foreign policy that then requires the arms industry. And there's certainly nothing new about that.
I think one of the ways this came up most poignantly is the revelations last week that dozens of former generals and colonels feeding at the trough in the Pentagon, getting talking points from Rumsfeld himself, turn up on these TV shows. I mean, wow. What is more poignant than that?
Tell us this whole story in case some people don't know it.
Well, it turns out that there was a considered effort run by the Pentagon to invite dozens of former generals and colonels under the Pentagon umbrella to get talking points and briefings on Iraq, and actually free trips to Iraq, and then they come back and they were farmed out to the various networks and cable networks and so forth. Is this a great country or what, And they would make believe that they were military experts. Many of them, of course, all of them talking from the Pentagon talking point, but many of them sort of selling working for the defense contractors whose weapons they were, praising to the skies. It used to be of the essence of a commissioned officer that you did not lie. And he felt that acutely, and so do I. If you can't depend on some modicum of integrity on the part of commissioned officers in the armed forces, retired or active, then we've reached a very sorry pass, and the whole system has been corrupted.
Gore's basic thesis is that what we're seeing now, roots are in this development of what he calls the national security state. And essentially, I guess he would say, his thesis is that it wasn't really necessary. There were other ways to deal with the Soviet Union and post-World War II world. What do you think of his idea that it was exaggerated? And in terms of your briefings, maybe you can tell us about your job, about having to brief the president.
Well, one of the invigorating aspects of working in the CIA is that we were the only game in town that could tell it like it is. And I worked there for 27 years. And if we were to be criticized for anything, it would be probably for the perverse delight we took in telling the president, don't believe what the Pentagon is saying. The Soviets are not 10 feet tall, they're 5'9" and shrinking, okay? Or this State Department policy is not having the effect that you're hearing from the Secretary of State. On the contrary, it's doing this to us, okay? Now, we used to be able to do that. And that was very, very exacting. So in watching what's happened over the last 7, 8 years and seeing the politicization of intelligence, where not even the analysts are able to express their views freely, that just like the NASA scientists, they need to be aligned with the administration's policy. The scandal is that everybody sort of fell into line. Very few people quit, and the whole system is ruled by people picked by Bush to align his policies, and you see the results.
You're talking about the CIA not being political and trying to give real analysis, but that's also the same CIA that's organizing coups and overthrowing elected governments. Mm-hmm. From Africa to Iran to Latin America, at least the operations side of the CIA. Mm-hmm. Talk about what that difference is between if there is one, between the two sections of the CIA.
It's a structural fault, a very serious, damaging structural fault. How are you going to have one place charged exclusively, the only place in town charged with producing objective intelligence without fear or favor, no policy agenda, and had that same director responsible for running wars in Nicaragua. What kind of credibility is that director going to have when he goes up on the hill and they say, well, what the prospects for the war in Nicaragua? Give me a break. The covert action side, if it's going to exist, should be separated from the analytical side, and there should be at least two agencies.
One of the critiques of U.S. foreign policy during this whole Cold War period, and then particularly the CIA, and most people think of the operations side of the CIA, is that while there was a Cold War and contention going on with the Soviet Union, a lot of the CIA and U.S. policies, CIA's policy and activity was actually directed against more indigenous national liberation movements, independence movements, socialist movements, just more to do with what kind of country they might become rather than an extension of the Soviet Union. But everything's called the Communist plot. And so you can get rid of Lumumba and you can go after anyone you don't happen to like.
Well, Gore Vidal's presentation reminded me of that period, Kennedy coming into office. I was reminded that on the 6th of January, 1961, Khrushchev made his big speech about communism going to advance through wars of national liberation, okay? Now, Kennedy, of course, had been in Indochina as a congressman, as a senator, and he had been exposed to the myth, in this case it's correct, that this was all kind of orchestrated by Moscow or China, okay? And finally he came back, when he came into office, his inauguration speech 2 weeks later, after Khrushchev spoke, of course addressed this kind of challenge worldwide. And then his first meeting of his National Security Council, 15th of February, 1961, he read part of Khrushchev's speech, Wars of National Liberation. He said, all right, I want you all to get a copy of this text, read the whole thing, and ponder it. Think about it. Is that the way they're going to come at us, okay? So then next thing we have is the Bay of Pigs thing. Big black guy, weakened Kennedy immensely. 2 months later, the Vienna meeting with Khrushchev, where Kennedy himself told his close associate, he beat me up mercilessly, 2 months later, August, Berlin Wall goes up, I mean, this is Cold War stuff. This is not a myth, okay? So Kennedy's on his back, trying to figure out how to do this. And sort of comes to the realization, I think, that strategic parity is the new reality. Khrushchev knows that, and so he puts the word out, find me these wars of national liberation. And some bright Pentagon folk go down and they say, well, there it is, Vietnam, that's where it is, Now, that I feel really close to, because I was the analyst in charge of Soviet foreign policy toward Vietnam, and I could see that all this business about Soviets having influence in Hanoi was really a myth, okay? Why? Because they had already sold out Ho Chi Minh in '54 at the Geneva Conference, and Ho Chi Minh was not gonna let that happen again. So this whole business about Harriman saying the Soviets are running this insurgency, we need to persuade them to, quote, use their influence in Hanoi to get them to stop. What influence? They didn't have any. I couldn't get that message out. I had to resort to an academic journal to write that, Problems of Communism.
But they didn't want to hear it.
Yeah, they didn't want to hear it. It was sort of, they really thought, some of them, Harriman included, that somehow or other the Soviets would realize where their real interests lay and pull our chestnuts out of the fire. Whereas wherever they thought their real interests lay, they had no influence in Hanoi.
Have you found any difference between Democratic and Republican administrations in your experience on the issues of foreign policy?
Well, there have been differences of nuance and policy of a gradual kind, but what I would say is that the difference between all previous administrations and this particular Cheney-Bush administration is of a magnitude that has never existed before, that we have a difference in kind here, not just a difference in degree. I think Gore Vidal is absolutely right when he says the events of the past couple of years present an entirely new situation here. a new challenge to our country, that there's nothing in our history that gives us any guidelines as to how to deal with it. I mean, every presentation I make, I start out with three factoids. Number one, the world is running out of oil. You can look on the Iraq War as the first resource war of the 21st century. Number two, global warming, a related issue of transcendent importance. And number three, not least, and the way I present this is that in the 45 years that I've been around this Washington area, this is the biggest sea change that I've noticed. And that is that we no longer have in any real sense a free press, a free media. That is big. That's the fourth estate, which Edmund Burke said is more important than all the other estates. Without that, how can we protect our freedoms?